Excellent. And thank you for the opportunity to present here today. My name is Matthew Spaniel, and we're joined today in the gallery from my co-author and co-collaborator, Nicholas Rowland from the Early Mornings in the USA. I'm located in Aarhus in Denmark, and I'm a researcher at Aarhus University. Today we're going to talk about the futures and foresight science as a scholarly discipline. Right. So a lot of this conference has been about the role of futures and things like socio-technical imaginaries. But I'm here today to talk about futures and foresight science as a scholarly discipline in which there are approximately 200 to 300 researchers at any given time who are actively investigating the future. And these would be some of the journal and the outlets that these scholars are presenting in, or presenting their work in. Journals like Futures and Foresight, Technological Forecasting and Social Change, Long Range Planning, the Journal of Future Studies, Futures of Foresight Science, and European Journal of Futures Research. There are more, and that's by no means an exhaustive list. But it is to kind of give you an idea that what would happen and what happens when we take this scholarly discipline as a legitimate field of scholarly research, right? If we go back to the origins of STS, right, and primarily thinking about the laboratory studies, right, done in the late 70s, we have then, anthropologists, right, and sociologists entering the laboratories to find out how are these laboratories constructed, and how is it the truth is being made in these different settings. And so what if we take this discipline seriously and we walk into the places where these scholars are actively creating futures and try to understand their world as they see it? And we've been doing just that over the last better part of a decade now. And here's some of the things that we've found out so far. We found out that strategic foresight is essentially composed and compiled of an applied foresight toolbox, right? So these are the tools that are used as, let's say, engines to create futures in the present. So tools like forecasting, scenario planning, wargaming, and modeling is something that's quite well known to STS scholars, but there are other things like technological road mapping that really haven't been covered very well in STS. And these are kind of the tools that seem to kind of unite this field of strategic foresight, right? And often these tools are found in, let's say, MBA programs. So there is a pedagogical angle that is well developed as well, that we see occupying most business schools around Europe and also in the United States. If you look back at the origins of a lot of these tools, right, we find that they come out of military scholarship. So Herman Kahn in the 1960s, working for the Rand Corporation, right, came up with some notions about thinking the unthinkable and how to win the thermonuclear exchange with the USSR. The title of that book, On Thermonuclear War, harkens back to Karl von Clausewitz's book, right, On War, right, from the 1830s, where he was talking about the fog of war and politics as or war as an extension of politics by other means and so forth. If we look at the field today, if there was a theory of strategic foresight, it might sound something like this, that there's distributed knowledge in all of the heads of the people in say planning groups, right? And we'll come back to this notion of groups quite a bit, because we find most of the applications of these tools to be in groups. Maybe they be in executive or board type situations or planning groups, but you'll find these tools in all sorts of organizations today. Right, and they use these tools to what they say to discipline the imagination, or to put frameworks around the boundaries of what there is what they're able to then imagine in order to develop some kind of improved conversation. And this conversation, the quality of these conversations lead to then more effective strategies. If you look at the history of strategic foresight, it was primarily birthed in the late 1960s when a lot of those journals were founded, and it's seen some development over time, and the tools seem to kind of wax and wane in popularity, right? And we see more and more of these tools going into, say, a distributed type of environment now with more online tools and more sharing being able. So these groups aren't necessarily, say, pinned down to the workshop table. If we look at the literature that's prevalent inside of the world of future studies, there's a very exceptional quote that comes from Bradfield in 2008, and bear with me, I'm going to read this because this is going to become a very important part of this presentation. So even the term scenario itself is not a very precisely defined concept. It means different things to different people, and accordingly is labeled and applied in widely divergent ways. And the term elicits all kinds of vague and loosely defined concepts. The consequence, according to Kaki, is that few techniques in future studies have given rise to so much confusion as scenarios. This confusion may be explained by the fact that, unlike other long-range forecasting methods, there appears to be no solid theoretically based foundation underpinning scenario techniques. As a number of writers have noted, there is, in fact, a paucity of systematic research, leading Shermack to conclude that the status of theory development in the area of scenario planning is dismal. So that's our point of entry, right, into this world of future studies and foresight. But what if we take a step back and think about how can we then approach this from an STS lens? And these authors here provided some of the sensitizing concepts that my co-author and I have used along the way to try to make sense of what's going on inside of these different planning sessions. And so if we want to think of the levels that we can understand the field of future studies from, it's quite interesting to think about the ways that the future is then evoked. So first of all, we have this, say, workshop setting where these facilitators are using these strategic foresight tools inside of these group-based conversations, right? Creating futures in the present, primarily to plan, right? We've got then the field of the scholarly community of futures and foresight researchers that are then writing papers about these processes, right? And these groups can be planning also for the future of all sorts of things. Often it's the future of their organization and the core concerns that they're dealing with and wrestling with. STS takes another step back, right? Let's then take a look at the scholars. So now we're looking at the researchers that are looking then at the people doing the planning and the practice, right? And another level of interesting things is that oftentimes in these workshops and using these tools, we'll end up in situations where they'll be uncovering these futures and making these futures more tangible in the present, and they'll use those to do research. So then maybe they'll even use personas and create these fictional characters, right? And they'll try to explain the day of a fictional character in the future, right? And then they will be using those personas, right, to investigate some of the implications of that planning. So we've got a number of different and interesting levels happening here. So we've made some contributions directly into the futures and foresight literature based on, say, something of an architecture, right? So we've looked primarily at processes under study and objects under study, right? And facilitation and how the facilitation of these workshops and the application of these tools plays out in the human drama of practice. And then we've also looked at the patterns in academic inquiry of the futures and foresight scholars. So we're going to start back to this Bradfield quote, right? And I've got this little red underline of this section that there's a paucity in systematic research inside the field, right? So the first paper we wrote was The Future Multiple, right? And this paper looked very much at facilitation and practice and looked at the ontological notion of what is the future as it is enacted in these groups. And we came up with some modes for the future, right? So the conventional wisdom and received views from the literature itself says that there are contextual and nominal and historical reasons for the research question of why the future in future studies is plural, right? But when we take another closer look, right, we can understand that the ways that the thought experiments are being designed in these groups lead us to understand that these engines are then producing these different futures in the present, and they can take the form of a number of different modes. All right, so the next section that we'll look at is that there appears to be no solid theoretically based foundation underpinning scenario planning techniques, right? So the next paper was called The Social Foundations of Scenario Planning. And so often in this literature, they'll describe the steps or phases or stages of scenario planning to follow some kind of sequential or chronological order, right? When you go to the site in the setting of where this is actually taking place, we find a very different reality, right? We find a reality that that it is really much more of a socially negotiated process, right? How do you know that a scenario is being ready and it's ready, definitively ready to use, right? Well, we've developed it and now it's ready for use. So, but are you sure that it was totally ready, or should we go back and then change the way that we've developed it so that we can get a different use out of it? And we find that the facilitator plays quite an essential role to overcome the objections of what it does to deal with the future. The next one is that the status of theory development in the area of scenario planning is dismal. Now, this leads to something of a pattern inside of the scholarly literature, right? So we're leaving facilitation and practice, and we're looking now at the patterns that we find in the scholarly literature produced by future studies and Foresight scholars. And there's this often repeated claim that seems formulaic at the opening of a lot of these papers. They said that, you know, the status of the theory is dismal and the methods are in quite this chaotic state of affairs. And so we asked the question, what are the consequences of repeating the dual claims that theory is dismal and there is methodological chaos? We find that when we look at the dismal theory part of that, right, what it is it serves as a justification for these scholars to then import new theories from outside of futures and foresight science. And what does that do? That means that there's more contending theories at play inside the literature, right, which kind of leads to this this kind of what we're going to call a paradox, right? And with the methodological claim, or the methodological chaos claim, follows quite similarly, that the scholars will then try to organize these different methods and different typologies, and then these typologies seem to build up, and then we're stacking up the methodological chaos. Doesn't seem like a very good way out. So the upshot of this is that we urge a more empirical approach to the field, right? Which is what we did in that first paper and the second paper, to really go into the field and try to understand, right, from this sociologically informed, say, and the concepts from STS, right, to really understand what is it that's happening in practice. And the final paper is that draws off this claim that few techniques in future studies have given rise to so much confusion as scenarios, right? So we went to the texts, right? So if you go back to the origins of the field, right, this was a problem already in the 60s, where Brown said that's another researcher at the Rand Corporation. So the scenario is really something else in this guide, possibly context, situation, plans, assumptions, parameter values, but certainly nothing you ought to be calling a scenario. So we mined the literature of futures and foresight science, and we came up with over 500 definitions of the word for the term scenario, right? And we limited it down to a couple hundred, and we did a strict word count. And what we find is that in this particular tradition, called the intuitive logics tradition of scenario planning, right, scenarios are future oriented. And drawing from Brown's negative definition approach, right, we find out that they're not counterfactuals and they're not forecasts because those are not future-oriented, although they might be thought experiments, right? They're not necessarily going to be in the world of scenarios as it's termed in the futures and foresight literature. The next criteria is that it has to be about the external context, right? So these scenarios are about a world outside of the control, often of the organization, right? But if they're inside the world of the organization's control, we're talking about prefactuals, option evaluations, management dilemmas, leadership visions, right? The next criteria is that, as previous speakers have mentioned, that there has to be some kind of narrative element to it. Right? And if it's not a narrative element, right, we're talking about single point forecasts, the extrapolation of variables into the future, forecasts and consensus forecasts. And if you're using systems dynamics models, you're looking at things like sensitivity analysis. Right? And then we come into one of the most contended words inside of the futures and foresight scholarly literature, which is plausibility versus possibility, right? For which there is some good controversy going on around those words. But if they're not plausible and they're not possible, are they really worth planning for? And so what happens is that we find other related fields of futures and foresight, like science fiction, future fantasies, utopias, and dystopias, but these aren't really useful for these groups to do planning around. So if you're an organization, it doesn't make a lot of sense to think about, what happens if the world gets invaded by aliens, because it's not really plausible and possible. So it's not really worth their time to think about those things from a strategy perspective. Right, and then these scenarios also come in systematized sets, right? And if they don't, right, we're talking about predictions. We're talking about like what if contingency plans, right, or a baseline scenario. So they're creating multiple scenarios inside of which they're then role playing and doing thought experiments about what is it that we can do, how can we win, and how do we lose inside of these different scenarios, right? So it's in this particular tradition called intuitive logics, again, it's not about trying to predict the future, but it's about finding ways to plan for it, right? And then finally, these scenarios need to be comparatively different from one another. And if they're not, we're talking about other tools, like there's other engines like morphological analyses that are being used, right, to try to identify then how to choose and select amongst different scenarios, right? Because it seems like there's a magic number inside of the world of scenario planning, and it seems to be about 4, right? It seems that beyond 4, it's a bit too difficult for groups to kind of coalesce and think and plan around. But when you're just sitting in let's say 2 scenarios, you end up in some kind of high-low or good or bad type situation. So they're developing sets of multiple scenarios, right, that are about the external environment, that are about the future, right, in order to affect this planning. And that's where we get this definition of scenario. So just on that note, I'd like to say thank you for listening, and looking forward to the Q&A.